Hello, welcome back. This is Roger Royce, host of the 10,000 Startups podcast, where each week we bring you original content on issues of interest to startup founders, mostly around startup law. And this week, we're going to do something that I guess crosses startup law, but also has a very powerful, strong business component to it. And that's really shutting down a company. Uh, and our guest today is Dori Yona. He's the founder of SimpleClosure. It's a company that specializes just in the shutdown process. So thanks for being here today. And why don't we just kind of kick it off right away with the big question? This is startup is a high risk, high reward sort of business. And most startups are going to fail. I mean, I've got clients that fail, and all of a sudden are a huge success. So that's just part of the process. And a big part of it is just kind of knowing, when to hold them and when to fold them, I guess, when you got to start over or when to double down. So let's suppose we made that decision that the company's not going to make it. It's time to, cut it loose, fail fast, maybe, uh, and then start over. So what does it mean? I know as a lawyer what it means as a legal matter to dissolve and liquidate a company, but but just for the startup founders in more of a layman's terms, can you explain what does it mean really to shut down a company?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me, Roger. I love that you're talking about the intersection of startups and law and a topic that's very dear to my heart, especially with what we're building. Um, Look, to your point exactly, what does it mean to actually shut down a company? I think it's one of those things that people don't really stop to think about. I think maybe the most common parallel universe that I've heard as an example is maybe kind of like life insurance. You know, when you're young, you're healthy, you don't stop to think about what happens if the worst situation comes. And obviously, it's not comparable exactly, but I think when it comes to shutting down companies, a lot of founders invest their entire soul, their entire life energy into this company, into what they're building. And unfortunately, in reality, startup ecosystem is high risk, high reward. The majority, by definition, the fact that you're venture backed and you're a startup, by definition, the majority of companies will shut down. If you look at the data in the last 10 to 20 years, on average, 93% of startups have shut down year over year. So statistically, 9 out of 10 will shut down. And what a lot of times founders don't understand is that, shutting down a company is not something that happens overnight. It's not like you wake up in the morning, you're like, I'm shut down. Shutting down a company is a process. It's has a lot of moving parts to it. There's obviously the legal component, legal aspect to it. Um, but there's also figuring out, what do I do with the customers? What do I do with the vendors? What do I do with IP? What do I do with the website? What happens to investors that invested money? What happens to employees that are currently employees of the company? So there's a lot of moving parts to actually figuring out a shutdown for a company. And so as a startup founder, it's something that it's not like you can shut down a company overnight. It's actually a process that takes time and a lot of thinking and a lot of resources. And so I think at a high level, when I speak to founders about this, it's realizing that it's actually a lot bigger than what they think.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so tell me a little bit about, I've been saying for many, many years that we needed something like this, in the market. The legal side of this is more complex than it should be. And it tends to be kind of tedious and mechanical, and it's just a lot of moving parts. I'm just curious, what's your story? How did you decide to start Simple Closure?
Yeah, I actually get that question quite often. A lot of people ask me, why would you start a company that helps companies shut down? So I'm pretty used to getting that question. It's kind of counterintuitive. And the honest truth is because I felt the pain. And I went through the process myself. A bit of background and context on my experience and my story. I'm actually a third time founder. Simple Closure is a third company I've started. I've been through the process of selling a company. I've been through the process of shutting down a company. And the process of preparing a company for shutdown was probably the most painful, bureaucratic, archaic process I ever went through in my life. Um, I asked myself multiple times when I was going through that process, am I the first founder in America shutting down? Like literally, that's what it felt to me when I was going through that process. And I had the worst experience ever. And so I think that like sometimes the best ideas are built from going through like real world experiences. And so I went through that experience. It was a very, very painful one. And after deciding to going back to building in early 2023, I had this idea that this experience that I went through bubble in me, and it has been bubbling in me ever since I went through it. And so what I did in early 2023 is I spent time doing two things. One, I wanted to research the market and understand how big is the market, how many companies actually shut down in the US. And the second thing I wanted to do was to speak to many, many other founders and entrepreneurs and figure out if the pain that I went through is something that everyone is experiencing, or am I a one-off case and I just had a really bad experience. And so I spent a good few months exploring those two avenues. I started digging into the numbers. I realized that every year in the US, on average, 93% of startups shut down. I didn't relax with that number and I wanted to dive a layer deeper. And I started looking at the SBA data, the Small Business Association data that they put out. And turns out that over the last 20 years, on average, between 700,000 and a million companies shut down every year in the US. And that was
Mhm.
like a holy shit moment for me. Because when I went through the experience, I thought I was like, there's no service out there to do it. There's no platform to automate this. It probably doesn't happen often that companies shut down, right? And so when I realized that there was a number so big, close to a million companies shutting down every year in the US, that was an eye-opening moment for me. Um, I actually, interesting enough, I looked at the other side of the scale and I looked at how many companies incorporate every year in the US. It turns out that on average, over the last 20 years, there's about 800,000 incorporations every year in the US. So if you look, it's actually really interesting. If you look at the overall SMB market, it's been pretty flat for the last 20 years. It's about 30 something million businesses. It goes up by a few basis points, down by a few basis points, but it's been pretty much flat, which I thought was really interesting. So you have this huge momentum and huge life cycle of companies being born and companies exiting and shutting down. And it's pretty much a similar scale. Um, so that was kind of my takeaway on the volume and the opportunity. And then, like I said, I spent a lot of time just speaking to founder after founder that's either going through the process right now, is thinking about going through the process, or recently gone through the process. And I think what really convinced me that there's a real opportunity and there's a real, opportunity to build here, is the pain and the voices of every person I spoke to. Every single founder I spoke to complained about the amount of time it takes. It took them an average 9 to 12 months to shut down. They were spending tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in shutdown costs. And I think the thing that was the most astonishing was in every case that we spoke to a founder, they ended up getting a fine or penalty or a claim because they didn't do something properly. And that was astonishing to me. So even though they spent almost a year of their life, even though they spent tens of thousands of dollars in almost every situation, they end up getting a fine or penalty months or years later because they didn't shut down something properly. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so really after hearing those they're really horror stories. Like that's the best term I have. It was so obvious that there's a clear pain point in the market, and there needs to be a solution built.
Yeah. Now, and your solution on that, it's software driven. Is that right? I mean, how does it work just generally?
Yeah, correct. So, the way we think about it is we are a technology company and it's software driven, and our mission is to be the TurboTax of shutting down. And so if we look at, a million companies shutting down every year, we want to be able to handle hundreds of thousands, if not the full million. And ultimately, you can't build a business like that if it's not software led. We will need, if we want to build a service business, we'll need a team of thousands of people just doing operational manual tasks, and that's definitely not what we're looking to build. So we've been really, really hyper focused from day one. How do we build the product, the stack, the workflows from a software driven approach? And so the way it works is if a customer wants to onboard to SimpleClosure and use SimpleClosure to shut down, they come onto the platform, they go through onboarding. During onboarding, we ask for important information about the company, basic information. Onboarding usually takes 10 to 15 minutes, but that's where we get their bylaws, their certificate of incorporation. We integrate into their cap table system like Carta. We get information from Pulley and other cap table providers. We integrate and take data from HRIS platforms. So if it's a Rippling or Gusto or Trinet, We pretty much get information about the board members. So really, we have a 360 view on the company, their stakeholders, their investors, their board members really get a full understanding. We ingest that data. But one of the things we do that I think is really unique is we don't only rely on the data that the customer provides, we also integrate into other public state databases and public data sources to make sure there's no stones left unturned. I think one of the most important learnings we had in the discovery process when we went to build was, like I said, in almost every cases, founders are getting fines and penalties months and years later because things were not shut down properly. And I don't think that it's a matter of not, intentionally doing it. Just you've been running a company for 5 years on average. You forgot that you had an employee in Washington 3 years ago that you laid off, and you just never shut down that payroll account. Or you opened, you had a team or an office in a certain state, and you have an account with that Secretary of State, and you changed lawyers, or one of the co-founders left. That knowledge is lost somewhere, right? And so we learned that through the horror stories of hearing founders share their experiences. And so what we do is we ingest the information that customers provide, but we also integrate into other public data sources. And what we do is we combine that data and we analyze that data and we put together a personalized shutdown plan that is tailored to your company. So there's no two shutdown plans that are identical on our platform. Each one is tailored to your company, your situation, your pref stack, your HR provider, if you're on a PEO, if you're not on a PEO, all of that is taken into consideration. And then what we've done on top of that is we've layered layers of automation and AI to streamline and automate parts of those processes. So we auto-generate documentation for you, like shareholder approvals and board resolutions. We auto-file certificates of dissolution with the state and the registration agents. We cancel foreign entities. We close out payroll accounts. We do distributions of funds to investors, tax write-off documents to investors. So really kind of A to Z, everything that's required to do a proper and full dissolution and shutdown. Our shutdown plans have 95 moving parts to them on average, where if you were to if you were to Google, hey, I need to shut down my company, what do I need to do? Typically checklists have, 10 to 15 things. Our shutdown plans have, on average, 95 moving parts to them. Excuse me. And I think what's really unique is, like I said, we've built layers of automation. You have an addition to the platform where you can log in as a user and see exactly where you are in the process. And you can sign documents on our platform. You can keep track of where everything is. Every customer gets an account manager, a wind down expert, dissolution expert that's there for them to help answer any questions. They get a dedicated Slack channel. And so we really are giving comfort and confidence to companies and founders that are going through the shutdown process, that we're there to support them and that they have everything they need to move on. Ultimately, we're giving founders, operators, and teams the peace of mind to move on to what's next, knowing that their shutdown is handled properly and that they can move on to whatever that is, starting their next job or their next company, whatever that may be.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm just thinking this is the perfect example of where artificial intelligence is really replacing a lot of the labor intensive tasks that are fairly routine and repetitive. And because people are involved, very, very costly. That's really fascinating. If you have a software or an AI system that can do the government filings.
Yeah, it's
um,
it's interesting you bring it up, Roger. I actually saw someone sent me this week. There was a list of that YC, the accelerator, put out of what are the verticals that they're most excited in getting companies in the winter batch of 2025. And the top one on that list was using AI to automate government documents and government filings. So it's very much kind of, I think, top of mind for a lot of people. And again, I don't think we could build the business that we've built and continue to build a scalable, business, the TurboTax type business, without building that level of technology and automation.
Yeah, yeah. As a theme, I've seen that a lot in a lot of different verticals over the years, and it just seems the tech is finally getting to where it's happening. You said something a minute ago. It's kind of interesting. You're talking about the costs that are involved in shutting down a company, and I'm sure that comes as a shock to a lot of the founders listening to us, like that it can be that expensive. So, like I'm a lawyer, so I think about the relatively straightforward legal part about filing dissolution documents, but there's a whole lot more to that, isn't there? There's a lot of other constituencies that you have to deal with. What are some of those that people might not be thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So when I think about cost, I think, most people think about cost in time and money, right? And so I think that that's how we've built the product as well. How can we save time and money? And so when you think about the costs, of shutting down a company. First of all, one of the things that we really try to educate founders if they're early in the process of considering a shutdown. So we actually have a lot of founders come to us when they have 3 to 6 months left of runway and they're trying to raise a bridge, they're trying to sell the company. And so when they come to us, we actually have a tool that's very, very useful. It's our SimpleClosure closure calculator that can help them calculate how much cost they should set aside for shutting down. Because one of the things that we see a lot happen is that founders think that they can just get to $0 in their bank account and say, okay, now I'm going to shut down. I have $0 in my bank account. And when we think about costs, I think what's really important for founders to think about, it's not just the cost of shutting down. The costs that you need to take in consideration when shutting down a company is you want to be able to properly wind down the company and put this behind you. Um, and in order to do so, some of the things that people don't think about is like, well, salaries are paid in arrears. You only, so if you decide to shut down the company on the 14th of the month, your team just worked from the 1st to the 14th, and usually you only pay them on the 15th, so you don't think about that, but you actually owe them money for the 14 days they worked. That has a cost to it. What about severance packages, right? What about your cloud bill? If you have a $20,000 cloud bill a month, you always get your cloud bill in arrears. So if you decide to shut down mid-month, you still have a cloud bill that you owe to pay for the cloud expenses until that point in which you decided to shut down. What about open vendor contracts? What about taxes, right? So when we think about shutdowns and we spend time with founders, I think what we really try to say is put aside the actual cost of shutting down, the lawyer fee, the SimpleClosure fee, things like that. You need to allocate a bucket of money aside to be able to cover your liabilities in order to properly shut down. And there are certain liabilities where if you don't pay them, they actually pierce the corporate veil, and the founders and the board members can be personally liable and on the hook for that. So, payroll taxes, for example, or wages, like if you're not able to make that pay, you're actually the board is personally liable for those payments. And so, it's a lot of things that people don't think about. So, when I think about cost, first of all, there's the cost in which it's just your ongoing burn rate costs in a sense that you need to plan in advance to set aside in order to shut down the company. And then there's actually the cost of shutting down. And so when you think about the cost of shutting down, the thing is to shut down a company, your lawyer is not enough. You need your lawyer, you need your accountant, you need your payroll provider, and then you as a founder, if you want to quarterback and understand all these moving parts and deal with all the closing of the accounts and the foreign withdrawals, you're going to spend probably close to a year if you're like a venture-backed company dealing with this.
Yeah.
And so if you think about what that means in terms of your salary, your time cost, the lawyer's salary, the accountant's salary, payroll provider support, that ends up starting to compile and become larger and larger expense. And then we can see, in those cases, companies spending tens of thousands and sometimes even, there's traditional firms that will come in and kind of help you kind of wrap this up. Those usually start at $100,000 minimum fees.
Mhm.
Typically, they might be like an ABC, and an assignment for the benefit of a creditor, for example. So that's where the costs really start adding up. And so when we always speak to founders about costs, we really want, to think about there's two aspects to it. There's the money you need set aside for paying out outstanding invoices and costs and taxes and things like that. And then there's actually the shutdown cost that has a fee associated with it as well.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Well, Dory, we're sort of coming to the end of the time. Before we leave, is there anything else that the founders should know about this process you'd like to leave them with that we haven't covered? And we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. I want to make sure
Yeah,
complete.
yeah. It's a great question. Look, I think the advice I always give founders around dealing with this are two things. Um, First of all, shutting down a company is a natural part of entrepreneurship. It is like when you hear about a founder that exited and sold their company for hundreds of millions of dollars, what people don't realize is that that founder usually failed at one or two companies before that. So I'm very, you know, optimistic that is the routine in the ecosystem of the entrepreneurship and the life cycle. Like you need to fail in order to succeed. You learn a lot more from your failures and grow a lot more. And again, I wouldn't call it a failure, but I would call it a shutdown. So that's first and foremost. I think it's just a natural part of the ecosystem, and it's an important thing to know. The second thing is it costs money to shut down. We just talked about costs, so don't get to the shutdown phase when you have $0 in your bank account. It's going to end up being costly. You might be driven into bankruptcy. It might, there's just things that you want to stay away from. And so, the second piece of advice we always give founders is don't get to zero in your bank account. And the third piece of advice we always give founders is regardless if you use SimpleClosure or not, don't do it yourself. That is the number one advice I give founders. And again, you don't have to use SimpleClosure. You can use your attorney, you can use other providers, but don't do it yourself. Shutting down, it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know, and you'll only learn that you made a mistake months or years later, when you've already distributed funds, when you've kind of moved on. And it's one of those things that can be really, really painful and drag on. And so our best piece of advice is always work with professionals, and don't, it's one of those things where you don't know where you don't know. Yeah, so that's kind of our my best advice. And obviously, if any company or founder or even attorney has a client that's going through this, we're here to help. We've done in the last year probably close to 500 or so venture-backed companies that have shut down on our platform. We've done probably more shutdowns in a year than a corporate transaction attorney does in their entire career. And so we have, a vast wealth of knowledge, and we're here to help founders get back on their feet and move on to what's next. And so we're here to help, and anyone can feel free to reach out and go to simpleclosure.com and sign up and get more information. And I'm also available if there's any questions.
Okay, got it. Well, thanks very much. Very informative, very interesting. This is Roger Royse with the 10,000 Startups podcast. We've been talking with Dori Yona, the founder of SimpleClosure, about how to shut down your company if that should be the need. So thanks very much for being here. Thank you, audience. We'll see you all next week.